In 1871, a single cow killed 300 people in one night. Over a century later, the tragic truth unfolded. When the residents of Chicago prepared for sleep on the evening of October 8, 1871, they had no idea that death was hot on the heels of 300 of them. For over a century, the culprit was a cow. It was 8:30 p.m. when the flames started to lick the city. With Chicago still recovering from a long drought, its arid neighborhoods filled with timber houses and sidewalks made it a tinderbox. Combined with strong winds, in no time the streets were burning. As the flames spread toward the heart of the city, the wooden houses were engulfed, their tar and shingle roofs fueling the flames even more. At the time, the Chicago Fire Department had 185 firefighters, with just 17 horse-drawn steam pumpers to protect the city. Numerous miscommunications would hinder their response to the emergency. By midnight, the blaze was uncontrollable, with the persistent winds carrying flaming debris across the river to the lumber yards, warehouses, and Southside gas works. In desperation, Mayor Roswell B. Mason sent messages to nearby towns calling for urgent assistance and ordered the local courthouse to be evacuated, with all prisoners jailed in the basement to be released. His move was a wise one. Shortly after, the courthouse collapsed, with the sound of the great bell crashing down heard from a mile away. The fire was ravenous that night, spinning in tornadoes through the city as it gained traction, jumping the river for a second time, with flaming debris hitting a railroad car filled with kerosene. The ongoing efforts of the firefighters were to be thwarted when a burning piece of timber lodged on the roof of the city's waterworks. With the water mains cut off, Chicago was completely helpless. It wouldn't be until the evening of October 9 that Mother Nature intervened, sending rain to extinguish the by now smoldering remains of the city. Days later, the embers were finally cool enough for a survey of the damage to begin. It was determined that the fire had destroyed over 2,000 acres of land. Gone were 73 miles of roads, 120 miles of sidewalk, 2,000 lampposts, 500 buildings, and $222 million in property, which amounted to 1/3 of the city's valuation prior to the disaster. But the greatest loss of all were the estimated 300 deaths. The human cost was high, with 1 in 3 Chicago residents also left homeless. In the days that followed, the city was placed under martial law to prevent looting and violence. As donations flowed in from both around the country and abroad, a broken Chicago began to wonder how it would ever recover from such a catastrophe. Amidst the chaos, and before the flames had even died out, rumors swirled about how the fire had started in the first place. The Chicago Republican would seemingly confirm these rumors when reporter Michael Ahern published a claim placing blame on a cow. It was said that Mrs. Catherine O'Leary had been in her barn on that fateful evening. While she was milking her cow, the animal had kicked over a lantern, starting the fire. Of course, Mrs. O'Leary's name wasn't mentioned, but the fact the fire was said to have begun in the O'Leary's barn at 137 DeKoven Street said enough. In no time, illustrations and caricatures were depicting the moment, with locals preferring to believe the rumor mill than the official report, which stated very simply, whether it originated from a spark blown from a chimney on that windy night, or was set on fire by human agency, we are unable to determine. Mrs. O'Leary's protestations that she had been in bed when the fire began were largely ignored, as was the testimony of Daniel Pegleg Sullivan, who had been the first person to raise the alarm. After freeing the animals, he had then informed the O'Learys, who were in their house with no idea of the fire that was about to destroy their livelihood. But strangely, the rumors persisted, with reports from numerous neighbors who claimed to have seen the broken glass from the lamp, all of which were unverified. As the recovered bodies of the dead were laid to rest and Chicago was slowly and painstakingly rebuilt to higher standards, life carried on. But for Mrs. O'Leary, the whispers, stares, and persistent accusations never went away, despite Michael Ahern's 1893 admission that he had made the whole cow and lantern story up. When she passed away in 1895 of acute pneumonia, Mrs. O'Leary was said to be heartbroken after the 2 decades she had spent ostracized and overcome with sadness. It wouldn't be until 1997 that the truth unfolded, with amateur historian Richard Bales gathering enough evidence to convince Chicago City Council to exonerate Mrs. O'Leary of guilt. Although never officially charged with starting the fire, the city's decision to exonerate the family proved just how ingrained the legend had become. When it came to the Great Chicago Fire, Catherine O'Leary had simply been the perfect scapegoat. As a poor, Irish Catholic immigrant at a time when both anti-Irish and anti-Catholic sentiment were high throughout the United States, the O'Leary family were an easy target on whom to attribute blame. In Chicago particularly, the growing political power of the city's Irish population only served to intensify the division. After revisiting all of the surviving evidence, as well as absolving Mrs. O'Leary of blame, Richard Bales came to the conclusion that it was highly likely that the culprit was instead Daniel Pegleg Sullivan himself, who had started the fire, accidentally igniting the hay in the barn while he was attempting to steal milk. While his suggestion was criticized by staff at the Chicago Public Library, the Chicago City Council were convinced by his argument, which had included scrutinizing the account given by Sullivan at the time, where he described his efforts to free the animals belonging to the O'Leary family. The Great Fire of Chicago was just one story among many on that hot, dry and windy fall day. At the same time, fires were also burning on the shores of Lake Michigan and destroying the lumbering community of Manistee. Some 250 miles to the north, a Wisconsin town and a dozen surrounding villages were also consumed by the Peshtigo fire, with 1.5 million acres of land consumed and between 1,200 to 2,500 people killed. The remoteness of the region and the fact the fire had burned through the telegraph lines meant the deadliest fire in American history went largely unreported, with the Chicago fire, fueled with the rumors of Mrs. O'Leary and her cow, instead capturing the nation's attention.